Great. Cool. Thanks for coming, everybody. Dan's just going to quickly introduce the event. We'll introduce Clark as well. So obviously we're here for Karl Marx Workers' Inquiry, International History, Reception and Responses, which is being published by notes from below. So Karl Marx, he's a writer, a researcher, the writer of this book, an archaeologist, and he's currently doing a PhD into the history and the practice of workers' inquiry. Clark's going to give us a kind of quick run through the writing of the text, the content of the book, and then we'll have a kind of 20-minute, half-an-hour Q&A afterwards as well. And then obviously we'll be here for ages and ask Clark more questions. The only things I need to mention as well, there's Lou's just one floor above. You can buy the books at the end, but also do available online tomorrow, I think. So you can order it and you'll be able to read online as well. Great. It's a stunning book. I think it's a really important historical political intervention into the kind of quite hotly disputed idea of Marx launching this initial workers' inquiry in 1880. So it's a really kind of transforms the whole history of the idea of what Marx's workers' inquiry actually managed to achieve. But Clark's going to tell you more about that. So he'll talk for a while, then we'll have some questions.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Dan, for a really lovely introduction. I'd like to thank everybody for coming here today, especially Mayday rooms for hosting us all, and in particular my comrades Dante, Matt, and also everyone from Notes from Below and Pagliacci Rossi that have been really indispensable in helping to produce this book today. So today I'm going to be talking about workers' inquiry, specifically Karl Marx's Workers' Inquiry, International History, Reception and Responses. This is something that I've been working on now for almost a year. I'm really thrilled today to be able to present the materials that have been collected in this book and talk a little bit about the hidden history of Marx's inquiry, which they reveal. So to do this, I'll give a brief introduction into what Marx originally meant by workers' inquiry, and then I'll talk about just two of the contexts in which workers' inquiry was used within Marx's lifetime. I'm only going to talk about two of them. So talk about all of them, or even more than that, then we'll be here all day. So yeah, hopefully by doing this as well, that I can encourage a sort of wider discussion or appreciation for the usefulness of workers' inquiry as a concrete form of intervention into the class struggle of our own time. So in 1880, Marx composed this really significant document called the Enquête Ouvrière, the Workers' Inquiry, a huge questionnaire with 101 questions, which inquired into the experiences of the capitalist workplace from workers' own perspectives. As its title suggests, the inquiry was originally addressed to workers in France, and it was produced and distributed there by a socialist newspaper called La Revue Socialiste. Now, alongside the questions that Marx poses, he also includes a very important introduction to this original inquiry. And in this, he states his idea and his sort of vision for what a workers' inquiry should be, what it might entail, and I suppose fundamentally, the purpose that this should serve for the workers' movement. And this purpose was to facilitate worker self-organisation. Marx is really clear about this. He says that only the working class can apply energetically the healing remedies to the social ills from which we suffer, and that the working class should not rely on saviours sent by providence. And so what he really means by this is only workers can secure their own emancipation. And in terms of how a questionnaire might go about facilitating or stimulating something like this, that becomes clearer when we look at the questions that he originally posed. So Marx asked workers to compare the value of their labour power with the value of the commodities that they produce in any given workplace. He also asked workers about the dynamics of the production process in different industries, about the skill required, the effort required. He asked about management techniques and how these can be used to control and divide workers, and also about the cooperation required in the labour process, as well as things like resistance and strikes. And by answering these questions in turn, workers can not only reveal a massive amount of information about the capitalist labour process, but they can come to understand the leverage which they already hold within that production process and the potential political power that this can be translated into if workers organise. And indeed, by sharing this questionnaire across different workplaces, workers can also come to a greater appreciation of their common interests as a class across different industries, different sectors, and even different countries. So in a nutshell, that was Marx's sort of idea about workers' inquiry, to affirm the workplace as a site of social and political struggle. And since he composed this questionnaire, the method or the political practice of workers' inquiry has gone on to have a massive influence, particularly in the mid to late 20th century and also today. I know there are many comrades here who ground their politics today in Marx and in workers' inquiry. And there's another event on in London right now, I believe, about workers' inquiry and the possibilities for worker organising today. So clearly it's had some kind of influence, you know. It's particularly used in Italy in the 1960s and the 1970s, helping to give rise to a very important historical moment of operaismo in that context. Now, there also exists a really significant scholarship which tries to trace the way in which different groups from all over the world have tried to use workers' inquiry, either based on Marx's original survey or using variations of this with reference to his original programme. And this scholarship thus promotes workers' inquiry today. But scholars encounter a frequent and recurring problem when trying to consider, or when considering the origins of inquiry within Marx's own time. Because scholars agree across the board that the original workers' inquiry was a failure, that it received no responses from workers, that it didn't circulate outside of France for 60 years, and that ultimately it was forgotten until rediscovered, namely by American Trotskyists in the later 1930s and 1940s. And it's really at this point, from the sort of 1940s onwards, that the real history of Marx's inquiry is said to begin. Now, it was in considering this 60-year gap that's said to exist that led me to do a little bit of research. And originally, I wanted to just see what I could find out about the original circulation of the Enquête ouvrière. And by reading, I think it's volume 24 of the Marx Engels collected works, there's a really interesting endnote in an appendix to that book, where the original editors of Marx's collected writings claim that the workers' inquiry did not only appear in France in 1880, but that it also appeared that same year in a socialist newspaper in the Netherlands, in a socialist newspaper in Italy, in Milan, and in a Polish socialist journal published in Geneva, in Switzerland. And I was really astounded to find this right under our nose this whole time, this indication that clearly the workers' inquiry had some kind of influence if it was appearing in all these different languages and in all these different countries within just a few months of when Marx originally published it. So I decided to do a bit of archival research, becoming determined to try and track down some of these reproductions. I mainly used online digitalized archives from Italy, Poland, and Netherlands. And sure enough, I found a version, not all these old socialist newspapers survived, by the way, but the Dutch paper and the Polish paper, which reproduced the questionnaire, do. And these are really interesting because these publications include a new introduction to the inquiry, stating that not only is Marx's questionnaire universally applicable to studying and scrutinizing the capitalist workplace, but that it should be expanded and updated and used in different contexts to gain a more accurate knowledge of different workers' situations in different regional and national circumstances. And so I did a bit more archival research around this and found that the inquiry was either referenced or reproduced in even more newspapers from that year in both the Netherlands and in Poland. It received responses from workers in both those contexts, and particularly in Poland, the inquiry was actually used as a significant feature of some of the first organizing efforts of the early Polish socialist movement. So I'll talk a little bit about these two contexts, about Poland and the Netherlands, to give a sort of flavour about the kind of material that appears in the book. So Marx's questionnaire first appears translated into Polish in July 1880 in a socialist journal called Równość. Równość, which means equality, was printed in Geneva by a famous communist called Stanislaw Mendelssohn. And it was printed there in order to evade censorship and political persecution in Poland itself, which at that time, of course, was partitioned by the Russian Tsarist Empire. So there were many socialists from Poland organizing in Switzerland at this time. And in his reproduction of the inquiry, Mendelssohn, or the other editors of Równość, write that if such a questionnaire as published by La Revue Socialiste is necessary in France, then so too should this be necessary in Poland. Whilst the questions do not consider every aspect of Polish workers' lives and experiences, we can nonetheless amend this by updating it and issuing a new questionnaire in a subsequent issue. Now this intention to publish a new questionnaire modelled on Marx's original survey is confirmed in another socialist newspaper also printed in Geneva by Mendelssohn called Gesellschaft, which means daybreak. And in many issues of Gesellschaft over the course of the 1880s, they advertised the Workers' Inquiry as available to buy from the editors in Geneva. Significantly, in 1886, Gesellschaft issued a massive appeal for workers in Poland to use questionnaires to aid their organizing efforts in the workplace. They claim that questionnaires, some of which have already been printed in previous years and are already in circulation in Poland, should be used to this end. They recommend to workers who do not have access to these questionnaires to compose their own questionnaires, to think about their own questions when approaching and investigating the workplace. And indeed, Gesellschaft issue a list of sort of preliminary ideas, preliminary questions that workers should think about when trying to do this. And again, each of these questions has been reproduced from Marx's original survey. The point of this Gesellschaft claim was not merely to find out about the workplace, but for workers to use autonomously themselves in organising at work. They claim that by building up blocks of workers' knowledge from around the country, they will be able to unify the Polish working class and unleash, in their own words, a universal uproar of protest. So clearly, the survey is being used here, not as a means for the socialist intelligentsia to find out about working conditions and workers' situations, but for workers themselves to use and translate into concrete action, to resistance, and to fighting exploitation, and to fight for political freedom as well. And far from just high-sounding rhetoric, Gesellschaft were very serious about this. They reproduce a letter written by a worker going by the name Wola, who details the realities of work in 6 different factories in Poland at this time. And Wola's letter continuously references the dangers that workers operated under through threats of deportation and arrest for the crime of actually organising at work. Indeed, Gesellschaft also state that there are ways of corresponding with Poland, which of course we cannot write about publicly. And this really testifies to the fact that there existed these underground networks at the time to smuggle these inquiries and smuggle these newspapers, not only into Poland, but around different workplaces. And one significant group which pioneered doing this, and which had concrete connections to both Równość and Gesellschaft, was an early political party called Proletariat. And Proletariat printed their own newspaper, which included data and information submitted by workers about factory conditions. And by circulating this around, they were able to coordinate mass action, supporting strikes, generating support funds for workers, and some very historically significant victories, which are detailed in the book. And the use of questionnaires by all these groups, in particularly the group Proletariat, would even influence some groups in Russia as well. It's one of the first important, what we would now call early Marxist organizations in Russia, a group called the League of Struggle, the Emancipation of the Working Class, which Lenin was a member of. They extensively utilized questionnaires and other kinds of surveys in St. Petersburg around about that time as well. I should also add that Rosa Luxemburg was at one point a member of this group Proletariat. So clearly workers' inquiry was being used extensively in Eastern Europe within a decade of Marx originally composing the first survey. At the same time, workers responded to the survey in the Netherlands, and these are really, really interesting to examine. So Marx's inquiry is first produced in the Netherlands in a socialist newspaper called Recht voor Allen, Rights for All. And it was in a slightly abridged form and with some slight edits to the questions as well. But of course, they were forced to admit in a later issue that they had reproduced this from La Revue Socialiste, the original journal. And in thinking about these Polish worker responses, which by the way were not, to my knowledge, published in any of these contemporary newspapers, but we know that they exist because they were discovered in the archives of a contemporary socialist sympathizer by the late Labour historian J.M. Velker. She actually published the complete Dutch responses in a monumental study called Heren en Arbeiders, Gentlemen and Workers, in 1978. And a selection of these Dutch responses have been translated into English for the first time by Riva, one of our comrades here today, and these have been included in the book. So in looking at the worker responses to Marx's survey, not only did workers reveal a massive amount of information about the dynamics of the capitalist workplace, but thinking about contemporary forms of work today allows us to compare these responses and think about the way in which capitalist work has been transformed and has changed over the past century and a half, but also more importantly about the ways in which work is profoundly the same. So you'll notice, if you read these worker responses, the particular questions that Marx asks, for example, about health and safety at work, about disease, about industrial accidents and means for preventing these. It's to these kinds of questions that workers submit the most detailed responses. And this might be unsurprising given the generally deplorable working conditions of the 19th century. But of course, we're living in a time of increasing normalization of hyper-exploitation in the workplace. Not only are workers today forced to bear the economic brunt of the contemporary capitalist crisis, but have also been exposed in recent years to the coronavirus on a mass scale, crammed into warehouses and retail and food processing industries. It was the same kind of fast-paced, exploitative, profit-driven, and largely non-unionized labor, which led the original respondents to Marx's survey to talk, for example, with worrying frequency about workers falling into vats of boiling hydrochloric acid, of workers losing their limbs to machinery in steel factories and blacksmith forges, of workers ruining their health and being driven to the point of insanity by the sheer pressures and stresses of overwork and exploitation. As one worker aptly sums up, when it comes to the health of our workers, this is simply not considered. Now, workers also respond to the survey, talking about the ways in which capitalist society affect them outside the workplace. Workers report a massive incongruity between the value of their wages and the rising prices of basic necessities, again, reflecting our contemporary situation in very stark terms. Now, Marx talks about all these things in Capital, these sacrifices made by workers. And Marx states that these are normal features of capitalist production, where workers haven't organized. And indeed, the solution to these problems, then as now, is for the working class to organize. And to Marx's questions about resistance and strike action, workers submitted very, very interesting responses. Workers reflect on their own experiences of going on strike and of successful strikes, improving their pay, shortening the length of the working day, and winning other specific demands. Workers also reflect on the failures of some strikes, with one worker concluding that this is because of a lack of unity amongst the working class as a whole. So we can see in the pages of worker responses to Marx's surveys, not only this emergent class consciousness, but also an early political composition of the working class as well. I should note, because a lot of this is really grim and really gruesome, that a lot of the responses are just really funny as well. Workers have a lot of interesting things to say. For example, about disease in the workplace, some workers say the diseases are the money fever which circulates around. Workers also talk about their frustrations of trying to organize with their co-workers. A really famous blacksmith called Willem Ansing actually responded to the survey, and he had a role in distributing it as well. And he reports that he tries to convince his co-workers to read socialist pamphlets, to join in discussion groups and political meetings. And he says, this goes nowhere, and I'm not going to do this anymore, because all workers want to do is go down the pub and get drunk. As another worker says, all you hear when leaving the factory is thank God for a drink soup. And on that note, because I know a lot of us want to relax and have a drink, I want to make one final point about the political significance of some of this archival material. So I mentioned previously that scholars agree Marx's survey was a failure, with no responses, having no impact. Clearly that was not the case. But scholars also encounter another problem when framing the original emergence of the workers' inquiry in 1880. Because it's tended to assume that this appeared out of nowhere, that Marx sort of conjured this up out of the blue, or at the very least that he was trying to compensate for the knowledge generated by the ruling class that he relied on in Capital, by the works of the factory inspectors and so on. And there's a political significance to contesting this, because if we do assume that it generally appeared out of nowhere, then workers' inquiry can be relegated to something of sideline importance. You know, one of those curiosities that Marx developed in the later years of his life, like, I don't know, trying to learn Russian or study calculus and all these things that he did. Interesting maybe, but not related to his wider political project. But of course, all these efforts were closely related to Marx's political project, and especially workers' inquiry. So 16 years before the appearance of the original Enquête ouvrière, Marx had been pushing for what he called statistical worker surveys to be distributed throughout each local branch of the first International Working Men's Association, a massive organization, which of course Marx was a leading member of. And he originally composed short questionnaires of 11 questions for this end. Each of these questions would later reappear in a more detailed and expanded form in the Workers' Inquiry of 1880. And his original idea was that annual reports could be published for workers based on this sort of early statistical survey. This was unsuccessful, it didn't really happen. But we know that it was of great significance to Marx, because at each annual Congress of the International for many years, he continually resubmits this idea as a central motion. He also urged Engels to compile a report based on data submitted by German miners when they had affiliated to the International in the 1860s. Again, showing just how important workers' inquiry was for Marx at that time. So clearly, the Enquête ouvrière was not just of great significance to Marx's political project, but it was rooted in his own organizing efforts with workers in previous decades. At the same time, the Enquête ouvrière and workers' inquiry generally has clearly been of great significance and great utility for workers. And I would argue that today, in the same vein, for anybody for whom the name Marx means anything at all, or for whom the importance of workers' power strikes home, then so too should workers' inquiry be centred and used today as a significant form of intervention into the class struggle of our own times. Thank you very much for listening. So it is a 140-year labour survey, so you know.
Really well. And so we've got time, maybe half an hour, for questions, Q&A, a bit of dialogue. So maybe we can take questions in groups as well, just so kind of not respond to the whole. Sure. I mean, I've got loads of questions, but also we will be hanging around afterwards. So if you have like longer discussion points, or we just have a standard Q&A, so we can kind of keep things quite short and concise as well.
Like the workers, we can all go and have a beer and chat about things.
Yeah. So if anyone has any questions. On here. Do you go around, and then if you all ask your questions, and then I can respond with them all.
I believe you're talking about presentation activities. Because you know, people think up that, you know, political science and theoretical, you know, revolutionary theory has moved on since then. Because the experience of the Workers' Institute shows that you need to organize in the community. You know? Organizing in the workplace has so many drawbacks. You know, the fascist bourgeoisie has so much initiative in the workplace. You know? So the practice of the Workers' Institute in the 1970s showed that the strength is in the community, organizing in the community. You know? And we were able to organize hundreds of, you know, of all nationalities, young, old, middle-aged workers, everybody in the community. And it was so successful that the fascist bourgeoisie organized 200 police to come and arrest all of us, you know, and imprison us for this work, you know, so which showed practically that it was really hurting.
I can respond to that now. Or do you want to take a few questions first? Yeah, we'll collect a few. Then. Yeah. Thanks.
The reception of the inquiry in Montreal is in late Eastern Europe, where workers
definitely.
But this brings me to my first question. Is there any trace of it having any impact whatsoever? And if whether you've had any thoughts about that, my hypothesis is to do have inch work. It's not very easy. Second point is, do you in your work offer Marx engagement with Marx and that congregation with the founder of social personal Marx mentioned extensively sides what we know of the way. There's some kind of work, some model work.
Let me deal with them. So yeah, I'll respond to yourself first and then go into discussion of these things. So about the reception of the survey in England, right, or in Britain more widely. So I believe it was first published, may have circulated earlier, I don't know, but the earliest evidence we have for the appearance of Marx's survey in Britain, it was published by the CPGB, the old Communist Party, in 1933. And it provided a very interesting introduction written by Andrew Rothstein, an important figure in the party at that time. And they indicate in their introduction to Marx's questions, and again, Rothstein's introduction is included in the text, that they intend to use workers' inquiry. And they say that study groups set up by the factory cells, which the Communist Party at that time had set up in many different industries, many different factories, should, I think he says, our study groups could do no worse than using Marx's questions in order to stimulate discussion and help their organizing efforts in the workplace. To what extent they did this, I'm not so sure, but there is an interesting text which the CPGB published that same year by Idris Cox, famous Welsh communist, and he details, I think he mentioned something about questionnaires being used, and certainly other forms of inquiry being used at that time, and he references in a really interesting little text called How to Work in the Factory and in the Streets, which again kind of brings us on to talk about community organising as well. He says that communist militants of the party in the street cells and in the factory cells should use the current literature being produced by the party in order to help their efforts. So it's something certainly that there needs to be a bit more archival research in, and I'd love to do that if I had the time. But I suspect that the CPGB were using it, maybe not so extensively, but they were certainly using it. In terms of workers who responded to it, I'm afraid I don't. And in terms of that work that they were doing at that time of organising, both in the workplace and the factory, also in the streets, the community organising, I would say that's something Marx also talks about in the survey, because of course it's a workers' inquiry, it's not a workplace inquiry. Whilst he does, of course, go into a massive amount of detail, and it's certainly skewed towards the workplace completely. And he does also ask about conditions in general, housing conditions, about workers' struggles against landlords, and other problems that people face on a daily basis that's not actually to do with going into the workplace. So I think workers' inquiry generally still has a lot of utility for that, and like you mentioned, the work of the Workers' Institute in that regard. In many ways, I would argue that that's also inquiry. It might not be based on the enquête ouvrière of Marx, but it's still in Marx's spirit, clearly. But I think you mentioned as well that we've moved on since Marx and things have changed. Certainly with social, technological changes, the workplace and indeed society is massively different from Marx's time. But I did something rather strange, and I would actually recommend everybody do this if you have the time. You actually answer Marx's original survey from 1880, and it actually has a lot of contemporary import, which I didn't expect. I did this at some spare time, and it kind of forced me to consider things. I've been involved in workers' inquiry things for years, something I'm really passionate about. And I suppose I have that kind of mindset of, I know what I'm talking about, I know what I'm thinking about in my own workplace. But when you actually look at these questions, and again, not all of them are to do with the factory or the workplace itself, they do force you to consider things in certain ways and reflect. And that's really helpful. I would say workers' inquiries of relevance with workplace organising and community organising. And certainly there's a lot of contemporary activism that I think ignores workers today. We can talk about society at large or the multitude or whatever, but not the working class. And so that's why I think it's very important that we do kind of recenter the workplace, not as a totality, but as a very important part of any kind of socialist or workerist organising. I'm afraid I didn't address the point about Marx's contemporary Belgian sociologist, but maybe we can talk a bit about that later. Okay.
I want to ask you a question about what the limits are of what at least based on the form of Marx recently. My work is mostly in like French and political history, so I have to apologize for the kind of examples that I usually have on moments. But the kinds of things I have in mind are like in 1934, Mayday went to work in various factories around Paris and conducted this kind of first experience. I think has a lot in common with organizations like Angry Workers and on the basis of that, I published an essay in 1935 on the data. And also in 1974, the French situation wrote an essay called Revolutionary Struggle to be discussed, drafted, and implemented immediately. And it was a set of notes for discussion to be written and distributed among workers. What extent do you think either of these examples could be called workers' inquiry in the sense of Marx?
Well, so I think that I'll just respond to the sentence that I clicked on because that's quite a very good question. I would say that particularly Simone Weil's work, this kind of not necessarily undercover research, but later socialist organisers called that like établissement in France, right? This establishment going into the workplace. Was I with établissement? Yeah. I would say broadly considered, I would consider her work to fall under the remits of a sort of workers' inquiry broadly defined. I'm not too familiar with the ins and outs of those particular instances. But of course, there's many different ways of doing inquiry, and Marx's original method, if you will, the survey, is just one form this could take. I would be quite strict in delineating what is a workers' inquiry based on Marx, by sort of limiting this to like, does it reference Marx's idea about workers' inquiry, the various things he wrote about it. But of course, there's other things that could be considered, I would say, workers' inquiry in Marx's spirit, which I think a lot of what you referenced would roughly fall under. Yeah, it's all about, I suppose, the political impetus for this, because there's a lot of research of the workplace, a lot of contemporary and historical sociology and anthropology of sort of workplace ethnographies and things like this that some people might call workers' inquiry, might even utilize questionnaires. I know that Max Weber produced questionnaires for workers shortly after Marx. And then, similar methods, but with a completely different political agenda. So if these inquiries or these investigations are aimed towards organising with workers and stimulating organising efforts for working class emancipation, then I would consider it broadly a workers' inquiry.
Is there any other?
Do you think there is a fundamental difference between workers' inquiry and sort of what we're on sociology or industrial relations? So, I mean, I'm recently I read a book about theory in the 70s, written by this completely bourgeois character, by this industrial relations specialist, working with Bergson. But he was this guy who worked in the bosses. But reading these accounts, the workers' struggles on the shop floor, obviously he really got what was going on. The accounts could be written by the contract. Of course, from the point of view of the boss's point of view, how do you stop this from happening? And so I was wondering, can you really delineate nicely between inquiry and ordinary?
So if you show consistency,
Okay, so yeah, I've just been asked a question about to what extent can we delineate the differences, or if indeed there are any differences between the types of inquiries initiated by bourgeois sociology or industrial relations, and to what extent this is similar to the practice of workers' inquiry that I've been discussing. I would say, yeah, we can delineate these things. Yeah, very strongly, yes, we can, we should. At the same time, of course, there's a lot of knowledge that can be generated through these types of investigations or surveys that can be of great use for workers. Probably the most famous, I mean, I think you mentioned at the end there, this particular researcher says, how do we stop this? How do we stop workers organising? Well, that was the main tenet of Taylorism, because Frederick Taylor, this industrial engineer and factory foreman from America, as one of the most needs, and he pursued inquiry, but from the boss's point of view, in order to stop workers organising, in order to come up with strategies for limiting workers' power. So that's the kind of type of bourgeois inquiry that we would normally kind of expect. But it's important to read Taylor from workers' perspectives, to kind of see this thing, see that inquiry is never a kind of neutral endeavour. It's not simply that. I think that's something that a lot of sociologists, influenced by Weber and so on, try to balance that out by being non-partisan, neither workers nor capitalists. But of course, inquiry is never neutral. Everything's produced according to a particular partisan perspective. So yeah, we should delineate those. But of course, this kind of knowledge that can be generated by the ruling class inquiries, it can still be of great use to workers, I think, absolutely. And I suppose the fundamental difference as well would be that bourgeois intellectuals can try and pursue workers' inquiry and also scholarly academic research. But workers are not going to necessarily, in the factories they're organising, produce things for that effort, or at least we would hope that workers' organisation would be a solid socialist direction. Yeah, I think we should delineate.
yeah.
What I do about now, where they want to expand the question in the Polish example, I think talk a bit more about what questions were, and also whether there was anything that they thought didn't apply, or maybe in your own mind you thought out.
Sure.
Yes, I'm finished. I'm finished.
Finish.
Yeah.
Oh, superb. Amazing. The context to which this thing appears is really incredible. Yeah.
I mean, we initially always thought but now
They're quite similar. I'll try and come up with a clear answer. Sure. We're discussing to what extent the workers' inquiry of Marx was adapted, particularly to the Polish circumstance, of what kind of things they wanted to investigate that were not in Marx's original survey. And then another question about the usefulness of workers' inquiry today, about what reading worker responses is able to reveal and why. That's a question about what is. In terms of method. Okay. Okay, yeah. To what extent questionnaires, particularly of Marx's original program, that's 101 questions, is that something useful for organising today, or should we do something else? So in terms of the adapting of the survey, whilst it was produced an exact translation, complete translation in Polish, the editors of the journal Równość give some kind of indication of what they would like to look at in subsequent versions of this. And one of the things they mention is looking at guild relations. So of course, that's something that we kind of assume was obliterated, not completely, but mostly in Western Europe at this time, in the later 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution. But in Eastern Europe, a lot of early kind of guild forms of workplace production still existed. So that was one thing that they indicated that they would want to inquire into. And in the Dutch survey, I mentioned that it was slightly edited. And this has led some people to believe that it wasn't Marx's survey. But a very astute reader of the newspaper Recht für Allen noticed how similar it was to La Revue Socialiste and actually wrote in to say that they've plagiarized this from Marx. Or not from Marx, because it was anonymous as well originally. But they plagiarized it from La Revue Socialiste, and you should have referenced La Revue Socialiste. And this actually prompted the editor of Recht für Allen to submit a very defensive argument about why I haven't read it. It's useful. We don't have to, cite everything. But then he admits that he reproduced it in La Revue Socialiste. But some of these questions have been slightly edited, just to look, for example, at some of the things that affected Dutch workers more than French workers, different kind of industries. A lot of ship riggers, for example, responded to the survey in the Netherlands. I'm not sure if many ship riggers were responding to it in Paris or somewhere else in France. I don't know. So yeah, just more about the specificities of work in different places. And then with regard to what extent should we use Marx's method today? I'm going to sound like a total oddball, but I found it really useful answering these 101 questions. I wouldn't say that any kind of contemporary questionnaires be circulated in workplaces or to help, particular trade union efforts, that we should reproduce 101 questions. It's quite tedious filling this out. Some of the questions that Marx originally poses, of course, are, of their time. They can be somewhat anachronistic in terms of the technology that he's describing. Marx also assumes largely a sort of fixity that exists in the workplace, which of course I understand given rooted factory production at that time. But he also asks questions that are massively relevant today. Marx asked about working from home, for example, which has taken on a whole new meaning over the past few years. But Marx actually asked about that and many things he could be referring to. But I think it's mostly like the spirit of Marx's inquiry that we should carry into contemporary organising efforts. Not so much the exact questions, and indeed the form that this took, a long questionnaire, it is something that a lot of people, even the respondents to it, clearly did find that of use, but maybe a bit difficult because, I don't think a single worker submitted responses to every single question. Lots of them are missed out. So this is because some questions are not relevant, maybe others people just can't be bothered. But that shows that people find what they find useful in it and they'll answer that. So there's other forms of inquiry that we can engage in today in Marx's spirit.
Yeah, so another I think that's the Marx is the Americans Europe. I'm interested in knowledge production and formalize of the larger and then on that basis, what is the relationship between the worker inquiring
economic struggles to produce market struggle, and presumably that is the revolutionary independent making.
Any other questions we could add on? Yeah.
Sure, yeah. I was going to ask about, is there any records of like the precisely how these survey, when the survey was, so obviously we know that it was distributed by a newspaper. He also mentioned this questionnaire in the workplace, kind of almost independently of newspaper things. Is there any record of say like whether they would hand out like physically in the workplace, if workers struggle with literacy, would they absolutely take their answers, right? Because that's the kind of lost in history. And also, second question is somewhat related is what sort of sample size were they working with? What kind of response were they?
Should I repeat the question? Yeah. So I had four really great questions there about the sort of tensions which might exist between the forms of worker organisation, particularly the trade union form of worker organisation, and later critiques of this which emerge out of operaismo and other kind of Marxian inquiry-based projects, and also about the First International. And you may have to repeat exactly what you pointed about the international. Yeah, about the tensions between the economic struggles waged by trade unions and other worker organisations and the greater political project of the First International. And then we had two other questions about the sample size of Marx's survey, how many people responded to it, and also the ways in which it was distributed, right? What ways, how did workers engage with this, and how did it appear to people? How did people distribute it, right? How it was administered. Okay, so I will try and answer all these questions in a sort of hodgepodge answer because they make me think of very interesting things. So it was administered in some instances by trade unions. Okay, and that kind of brings us to this trade union question as well. And Marx very explicitly states in an important address to the International about trade unions, which has been reproduced in the book as well because it helps to contextualize workers' inquiry. Marx states that trade unions should not just be used for economic struggle, not as vehicles for the betterment of wage labour, but for its abolition. So Marx is very clear about that. And I think what he's affirming with this very clearly is that trade unions are not just these reformist organisations with elected bureaucrats who work with managers and capitalists in order to ensure a better deal for workers over the sale of their labour power, but ultimately reproducing the capitalist system. Marx and Engels saw trade unions as potentially revolutionary vehicles for the abolition of capitalism, not just its management. And indeed, by facilitating the inquiry through trade unions, clearly they're valued in this regard, which kind of brings us to your point, Ewan, as well. So in the Netherlands, in fact, in the first survey in France, it was sent to trade unions around France. In the Netherlands, it was published in not only in Recht voor Allen, the socialist newspaper, but also in another newspaper called De Werkmansbode, I think I'm pronouncing that right, which means the workman's messenger. And that was the official paper of a massive trade union federation which existed in the Netherlands at that time. And it was probably through that workers actually heard about it, because workers are not necessarily reading all this kind of socialist literature. And not only was it facilitated through trade unions, but socialist militants would pursue inquiry and indeed pursue using questionnaires in different kinds of contexts as well. So we have some indication of how they would have done this. I think you mentioned, like, do we know, or is it lost to history? We do know how some groups in Eastern Europe did this. So the League of Struggle in St. Petersburg, they used questionnaires. They also used like undercover work And one of the ways they would do this, Nadia Krupskaya actually talks about this in her biography of Lenin, and she writes that Lenin would not necessarily send her, she was doing this on her own initiative, but very much relished that she was going out and collecting all this data. And she would wear like a worker's hat and sneak into workers' barracks and talk with other workers about working conditions and everything. And this is not someone just pretending to be a worker to get a kick out of it. This is necessary in order to find anything out. Because of the political persecution, if you rocked up to a workplace in St. Petersburg in 1890 odd, and said, oh, I want to go and ask about working conditions, do I get the hell out of here or worse? So yeah, there was sort of undercover ways of spreading this. One group in Poland called Proletariat, they printed like a sort of underground newspaper and circulated this around. So they're very sort of interesting ways in which they did it. And lastly, I think you mentioned the sample size. I should have said before, we have 58 complete responses from the Netherlands, and then no idea how many hands this survey went through, and how many people found it useful, but maybe didn't respond to it, or indeed some responses just may not survive. So,
I think we'll probably kind of finish up. It's kind of that now, but of course, there'll be time to carry on asking Karl questions, picking his brain on the book and the text are included. I will also pick that up as well. But I got, if it's all right, we could say thanks to Karl at the end for talking to us.